President Hassan Rouhani says Iran is one of the main victims of terrorism, blaming major foreign powers for supporting terrorist groups in the region.
Terrorism in modern time has turned into a new tool for different objectives and has been transferred from a marginal issue into an organized concept. Mujahideen Khalq has been one of the terror groups which has been following a political agenda devised by foreign powers, and the Iranian nation has suffered a lot from its crimes.
Rouhani made those comments at the Second International Congress on Iranian Victims of Terrorism. The president blamed the U.S. and some European countries for adopting a double-standard approach towards terrorism. According to Rouhani, these countries claim to fight terrorist groups such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda, but they turn a blind eye to state-sponsored terrorism of the Israeli regime. He also slammed certain regional Muslim countries for supporting terror groups, warning that such a policy would eventually backfire. The Iranian president added that Tehran will stand by oppressed people and victims of terrorism anywhere in the region and will support regional countries in the fight against terror. Well, to discuss that a bit further, I joined Mr. Tony Gosling, who is an investigative journalist, and he's joining us live right here in the Iranian capital, Tehran. Mr. Gosling, welcome to Tehran. I just wanted to ask you, you were at the conference this morning. I saw your face show up on the screens as President Rouhani there was speaking. I wanted to get your thoughts about attending the conference, the importance of such conferences, bringing to light the victims of terrorism, for example, in Iran.
Well, I'm not sure what you've already shown here on Press TV, and it's nice to be here actually in Tehran rather than on Skype. But one of the things Mr. Rouhani said, which struck me as really a message which needs to go out to the whole world, is the effectively the lack of action on the oil tankers. The fact that ISIS, this terrorist group that the West is supposed to be fighting, is able to trade oil freely around the world. And as Mr. Rouhani pointed out, the West boasts about its satellites being able to read the number plates, the newsprint even, on papers that people are reading in the street, and yet it can't see these oil tankers going around the world making money for ISIS. I would suggest, and there's a lot of people around the world, including people in the British military right now and ex-military people I've had on my programme in Bristol who point out that this is a farce. The British people and the people in the Western world are being sold a lie here, because actually, in reality, ISIS could be closed down in a blink of an eye, closing down bank accounts and also actually attacking the headquarters of ISIS in many places, but there's a particular hotel in Mosul, for example, which could be closed down immediately. But the West doesn't seem to want to do that. What they do want to do, though, is to bring more and more NATO countries in on the fight against ISIL. And we heard just within the last few days that now the Turks are also doing airstrikes in Syria. I and many other analysts around the world, and we've been discussing things over coffee here in Tehran, are quite convinced that the ISIS plan effectively is a kind of attack on Syria Mark II by the West, and that the only thing that's stopping this kind of being realised in the West is the cover that's being provided by the Western media. People like the BBC simply do not ask the basic questions that people around the pubs in England, the bars in New York are asking these questions, but the Western media doesn't ask them.
And President Rouhani, Mr. Gosling, also mentioned double standards when it comes to looking at terrorism. And I wanted to come to the specific case of Iran and the victims of terrorism within this country. You know, President Rouhani there mentioned MKO, a terrorist group which is now seemingly backed, at least somewhat implicitly, by the United States off its terror blacklist. Now, how do you feel about that sort of double standard?
Well, I can tell you one thing. You never hear anything in the British media about Iranian victims of terror. And I was quite shocked when I first heard from your publicity people here at the charity that there had been so many victims, 17,000 people. And yet, somehow, the Western media paints Iran as a terrorist country. In other words, that the government are terrorists. Well, this is just ridiculous. Every government has armed forces, but those armed forces aren't actually always terrorists. So that's just a ridiculous concept that I think really needs to be properly explained. Again, it's the Western press largely which is to blame for these misconceptions.
And of course, then the issue of Israel came up as well in President Rouhani's speech, Mr. Gosling. How do you feel about that sort of, as President Rouhani, I believe, put it, state-sponsored terrorism towards the Palestinians?
Well, it's not just towards the Palestinians, but yes, he's absolutely right about that. You know, the Israeli state, let's not forget, I'm an Englishman and I have friends, many of them are older people who served in Palestine in the 1940s under the British Mandate, and they will tell you very, very great detail about Israeli, as it was at the time. Of course, the Americans were the first country in the world to recognise the Israeli state, even though the British didn't want them to. There was the attack in 1946 on the King David Hotel, which was the British headquarters in Jerusalem, and there were many, many victims of those attacks. I think it was something like 80 people died in that Israeli terror attack, actually. I mean, this was the Stern Gang, people like that. Now, those terrorists at that time, in a way, the Israeli state was founded on terrorism, and ever since we've had people who have been involved in terrorist acts like the Shabra and Shatila massacres who've made it to the top of Israeli society. I must say also that we've got a similar problem growing in Britain, where rather than being put in jail, many people who are war criminals are allowed to walk the streets. Tony Blair, for example, many people believe he's a war criminal, and actually in some ways they're rewarded or promoted for their crimes. So we've got a twisted vision in the West. It's the kind of vision that the British writer George Orwell wrote about in the 1950s and 1940s in his novels, particularly 1984, where he talks about the twisting of reality, where war can become peace. We've got that really going on right now in the West.